We'll just get started. Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Patrick Chu. I'm the Policy Initiatives Lead here at ARNBC, and we're very glad to have Shannon Dames with us today to talk about her research, which focuses on life history and contextual factors enabling Novus nurses to thrive at work. The presentation today will focus on Shannon's qualitative study that was done last year in BC, and the goal of the study was to try and understand how unique life experiences and contexts of new graduate nurses interplay to enable or disable their ability to engage in the process of self-actualization as Novus nurses. The webinar will discuss the study findings and the current literature with the aim of empowering educators, employers, and Novus nurses with the tools required to thrive in their new graduate role. I'd like to introduce our presenter, Shannon. Shannon joined VIU's BSN program as a sessional faculty member in 2013 and became a full-time faculty member in 2014. She has worked in various capacities related to nursing over the last 16 years and has experience as a certified emergency nurse, forensic nurse, palliative care, and multiple public health programs from frontline through management. She has consulted as a program development specialist and continues to work at bedside through her forensic nurse examiner work. She pursued a master's in public health while working in the United States at Oregon Health and Sciences University and is currently completing a doctoral degree at the University of Calgary in the adult education program. So today we have scheduled an hour for the webinar. We'll give Shannon about 40 to 45 minutes to present her information and leave about 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions. For those who do have questions, please double-click on the questions tab located in the taskbar that's located on your screen. Feel free to type your question in that space during the webinar, and we will address the questions after Shannon is done her presentation. We are recording the session and will archive it on our website for viewing at a later date, and we will also post a PDF version of the slides onto the ARNBC website. So I'll hand it over to Shannon.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Just a word of warning as I start out here. I'm generally not told that I need to speak up. If anything, it's the opposite. So feel free to adjust your volume. The more excited I get, the louder I get. And I assure you I have no consciousness of it. So be aware. I also tend to go off on some tangents. So I'm going to try really hard because we've got a very short period of time and be disciplined in that way. But I want to acknowledge I'm going to touch on a lot of factors that people have done many dissertations on those each factor, and I'm going to gloss over them. So it's a lot of information. I'm available offline. This work, I'm very passionate about it. I'm very happy to talk to anybody who has further questions if we run out of time. So with that, let's go forth. Okay, so the big question of why I came to this research is trying to understand why some new graduates seem to thrive and others are not, and specifically looking at two new graduates in the same contextual environment, why one tends to be able to roll with it and another tends to suffer or kind of engage in more survival type behavior. So I'm not reading this. This is more of a placeholder here. This is really an overview of a lot of the factors that have already been in the research for decades. This is a very well researched area. The research I did this last year was more around the developmental end. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is talk about the developmental pieces. It's not an either or in terms of the external and internal, it's a both and. So even though I'm focusing on developmental, it's not to water down the other more external factors. I will mention them, but I'm not going to give them a lot of space. There is quite a bit of research out there on them. So I like to look at this as kind of like a tree. If we were all trees in a forest, many trees have deep roots, and they're able to survive a lot of the storms that kind of come their way, and there's just a lot more stability. Other trees have more shallow roots, and it makes them a lot more vulnerable to the weather. So if we look at it like that, like our new graduates, kind of like we're all nurses and we're trees, some of us have much deeper roots and some of us have more shallow roots. I'm going to expound on that a little bit as we go, so I'm painting a picture here. Okay, so the concepts that I'm looking at in order to understand this, because it's not so much complicated, but it is complex. So I used 3 different theorists, which many of you are probably familiar with at least one of them. Maslow's hierarchy, where we talk a little bit about why people experience stress. So what creates the cortisol rush. And ultimately, a little bit oversimplistically and a little too concrete, but it does give us some understanding, is when one of our basic human needs, which we can all relate to, is threatened, we experience a stress response. So the big question is, why, with the same looming threat, do some people experience a stress response while others navigate it as kind of a stimulating challenge? What is the difference between those 2 people? So looking at Anton Novoski, he's a well-known psychologist, and he did a lot of research looking at sense of coherence. It started out with a similar question when he was working with Holocaust survivors in the 80s. He wanted to know why some Holocaust survivors came out and were able to go on and live fairly high-functioning lives, while others went into a state of dis-ease, and what the difference was between those 2 people who had experienced very similar events. And ultimately, it's a very similar question to what I'm asking, is what are the developmental differences between these 2 people? So he developed a sense of coherence. It's actually a scored tool that has been well validated over the last 40 years as a highly predictive tool of health outcomes, both mental health and physical health, which are very tightly entwined. And he was able to establish that there are certain people who, even though unmet needs are looming, there's an overarching sense that all things will work out in a reasonable fashion, that they have the personal resources to manage that challenge, and that challenge is worthy of their investment. So people with high sense of coherence, they see the looming threat, but it's not experienced as a threat. It's actually experienced as a stimulating challenge. So these are the people in your work organizations that don't see change as a threat. They more take it on as it can even be exciting. On the other hand, people with low sense of coherence, they see change or something unpredictable as a threat to their basic needs. It sends them into a state of dis-ease, which is very much connected to what we consider disease. It creates a cortisol response, which is well documented, and that cortisol response is then what kind of spirals down into the mental and physical health conditions, which then, when we talk about how all of this connects, we have a lot of anxiety. We use addictions, emotional dissociation as reprieve from our anxiety. So you can see how all of this connects. If you have a low sense of coherence, you're going to be more vulnerable. In the workforce, we also see lower morale and more sick days. Okay, so anxiety. This is kind of what I'm feeling right now. I think we can all relate to that. What the body feels like, the muscle tensions, the holding our breath, all kind of comes down to a feeling of I'm not good enough, or there's a threat, a basic need where we're feeling a little bit void of. Every human has this, no matter what your sense of coherence is, we're all going to go into this state. It's just a matter of how long we stay in this state. Okay, so coming back to it, what we're really wanting to know is what are the interplaying factors on the developmental end that enable one to live one's calling, meaning that even jobs that have really menial tasks and checklists associated, there's meaning behind them. It's infused. They feel like there's something, they're working for a larger picture. They get lost in their moments. The time goes by quickly. That's living one's calling. And additionally, what is also helping them from getting pulled away from that thriving when stimuli happen in the workplace compared to somebody who kind of goes into survival mode? Okay, so we talked about sense of coherence, which is an important, I chose that concept because it's very connected to the literature, and there's a lot of quantitative data supporting it. And what we also connected to that thriving is, I'm just going to go through some of these bubbles here. So environments that support congruence, so healthy work environments, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Self-integrity and self-efficacy, And by self-integrity, I don't mean like legalistic black and white. I mean that one is able to be authentic to themselves, honor their emotions, work through dissonance, take a look at things that are ethically and morally distressing and work through them rather than burying them. Child-centered upbringing, we're really going to talk about that. Trauma, relationships of unconditional positive regard. And you'll notice I have it in black as self-compassion. Self-compassion is a word which we have all used, probably overused. It's lost a lot of meaning. It is, however, the most important word in my entire study, and if you go through the literature looking for it, it is a highly influential factor. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is on the developmental end. Okay, so this is where it gets good. So Rogers, he is a seminal psychologist. He's a forefather in the area of counseling. He developed this term called congruence. And it's really about us as humans. We have this, up to the age of 2 or 3, we kind of have this 360-degree personality where we're just completely authentic in every moment, whatever moment that brings, whether it's anger or joy or whatever, we express it. As we get older, we start to catch on that there are people that want specific things from us in order to be accepted, whether it's our parents, our teachers, our peers. We start to see that there's an ideal us that we need to be to feel accepted, to feel we belong. So what happens is we create these two parts of ourselves, the ideal self and the real self. The real self is that part of us that we innately know we are. And often that part of ourselves that we hide from others because we're scared that it won't be accepted. And all of this very much relates to Maslow's hierarchy, right? The need to feel belonging and esteem prevents us from being our real selves because those are such a requirement for us to flourish. So those that have childhoods where there's a lot of, or there's a lack of unconditional positive regard, which we're going to talk about, are going to have circles that are further apart. And if you have circles that are further apart, you're going to have a greater amount of shame in between. So I want to come at this from a couple different angles because it's a really important point. Some of you are more familiar with Carl Jung's work, working with the shadow. That we all have these shadows of ourselves, which is kind of those pieces that we repress. We stick in a little bag, which some people call their baggage, or we pack it down into our stomachs, which I like to call our shame bellies, and we all have them, right? They get packed down there because we can't integrate it or digest it out of fear of not being approved or accepted in this world. And our childhoods are where most of that happens. So some of us who didn't have a very good childhood, didn't have a lot of unconditional positive regard, had a lot of childhood trauma, end up having these circles that are quite far apart because there's more of a felt need to play a part into the ideal and less acceptance of our real selves. So it's lacking in authenticity and tends to have greater amounts of shame. Okay, so what that means in the workplace is we tend to, if we have high degrees of incongruence, we're going to be a lot more apt to perfectionism. So nursing also, and this is also in the research as well, also underscored in my study, when we train nurses, we tend to train to the ideal. While we talk about authenticity, it actually generally usually comes underneath putting on the ultimate display. And emotional labor is another concept, if you're interested, that's really illuminating in this sense. So we work for the ideal in nursing, to be the ideal nurse, and we tend to be fairly black and white in that. The perfectionism with those who are more incongruent, defensiveness, competitiveness, triangulated communication, also very common in nursing cultures. We don't tend to go right to the person. We prefer to do this kind of triangulated communication. It gets very normalized. And barriers to learning, defensive energy towards self-destructive thought. Lots of kind of negative thought rumination often goes on with that perfectionism. And I just want to be really clear with perfectionism too. Many of us are perfectionists. I would say I'm right in that boat as well. It's not all negative, so I'm not trying to be black and white here. Often perfectionism leads to some really high quality work, good work ethic. There are many positive things about perfectionism, and it really is on a scale. when we start going into the maladaptive perfectionism, and that's where it gets very, very limiting, and that's really more about the unrealistic standards on ourselves. And we then subconsciously start putting those same unrealistic standards on others. It's called social prescription of it, and you'll see that in this discussion a little bit more. Okay, so those that have those circles closer together tend to have high self-compassion. So that's why I'm gonna start undergirding self-compassion here, underscoring self-compassion. They tend to have an optimistic orientation. They see problems as stimulating challenges. As you can see, this is the same as the high sense of coherence. And they have an ability to learn from their mistakes. So rather than feel threat of making a mistake and getting feedback, they actually are more open to receiving it and learning and wanting to grow. It's not threatening their roots or their sense of self. Okay, so those that are congruent with these circles that are fairly close together would be the trees with the deeper roots. They're quite stable despite the weather, even with negative feedback, criticism, etc. They have a lot of self-integrity, self-trust, and a lot of stability. And they aren't so threatened by the weather, and sometimes it's even stimulating. So, and just a little note, which I'm going to come back to, congruence very much applies to cultures as well. So if we have a lot of incongruent workers, you're going to have a more incongruent workforce. And cultures that are more incongruent, and nursing is considered one of the most incongruent cultures. We tend to enculturate. So even if somebody comes in fairly congruent, we actually can hurt their congruence through their training as we kind of focus on this ideal and we forget to integrate the real. So just talking about compassion. Actually, I'm going to move this forward here. Okay. If nobody gets anything out of this presentation, I hope that self-compassion rings in your ears beyond today. It is the antidote to shame and maladaptive perfectionism. In the study that I did this summer, these are just a couple examples of some of the more congruent participants and how they talked about how they handled feedback, specifically, when they made a mistake in the field. Just to really confuse you, I'm going to talk as we go here just for the sake of time. So healthcare providers that suffer from burnout are also deficient of self-compassion. This is in the research. It's all over the research. Those who demonstrate higher levels of self-compassion are more likely to effectively cope with workplace stressors, as opposed to feeling overwhelmed by a sense of personal inadequacy, in addition to the initial stimulus. Also, those who regularly practice self-compassion have high levels of emotional intelligence and have a greater ability to be empathetic towards others, including their coworkers. Self-compassion is a protective factor. It buffers us against depression or emotional dissociation, mixed anxiety and depressive disorders, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders. One's ability to be self-compassion will buffer them from emotional exhaustion that can be the result of the insecurity and habitual rumination on self-destructive thoughts. Okay, so I hope I'm underscoring self-compassion here and how important it is. Okay, so what produces it? If we have this kind of magic bullet, not that there is any magic bullets, there are many interplaying magic bullets, but this is a big one. How do we get it? If we could just swallow a self-compassion pill, how great that would be. Unfortunately, it's a little more complex. So the big, most impactful factor that enables self-compassion is unconditional positive regard. I talked about it a little bit earlier. The most important years to have unconditional positive regard are as a child. We spend the first 20 years of our lives either integrating all parts of ourselves, the strengths, the weaknesses, the good, the bad, or denying the weaker parts of ourselves. And within those first 20 years is when we develop our shadows. It's when we fill our shame bellies. It's when our circles start moving apart. If you've had unconditional positive regard, meaning somebody looked at you as a child consistently and said, I see you, I love you, all of you, and I accept you, then those circles are able to come together and you're able to see yourself as a whole package without a lot of shadow and shame that's just waiting to be tapped. So basically, we spend the first 20 years of our lives building those shadows and those shame bellies, and then we spend the rest of our life trying to unpack it. And I also want to make a key point here, and I realized this with the study this summer, is that even though as parents we think we're giving our kids unconditional positive regard, it's not about whether we are giving it, it's about whether the kids are perceiving that it's there. So that is a really key point. Okay, so if any of you are looking like this right now, like, oh great, what am I going to do? Didn't have it, don't have it, got all the symptoms. I would just like to say you're not alone. There's a lot of us, and if you're a nurse, there's a lot of us. We tend to be a lot of us perfectionists in nursing. We tend to be a lot of wounded people that go into healing professions, and nursing being one of them. And in nursing school, we aren't really great at articulating some of these challenges either, talking about incongruence and some of those vulnerabilities. So I guarantee you there's a lot of us out there, and this is a discussion that we can start to have. And I will talk a little bit about if you did kind of those first 20 years, you did a lot of shame packing, a lot of shadow building, that it's not that you will come out of your childhood with low levels of self-compassion. That is also in the research. I'm sure there are outliers out there, but chances are you have low levels of self-compassion, high levels of perfectionism, and you have to consciously work against that in your adult years. So as a child, you get it naturally. If you had unconditional positive regard, as an adult, you have to build self-compassion consciously. Okay, incongruent cultures. So just to not limit this to the effects on the individual, incongruent cultures, we tend to see some of the same symptoms. So I speak a lot in shame because I think shame is, Carl Jung calls it the soul-eating emotion, and it is an emotion that we tend to be ashamed of. So we don't talk about it a lot, but it really is the only way. And if anyone reads Brene Brown, she talks about shame quite a bit. And the only way to dispel shame is to talk about shame. Those things that we don't like to bring up, that we keep in the dark, is to bring light to them. And culturally, we can do that too, is talk about how is shame arising in our culture? How are we using it, because it's often very artfully done. And sometimes we need to, with a lot of compassion, is bring that into the light. Okay, so incongruent cultures, we tend to see a lot of unconscious social shaming happening. So just to be clear here, there's people that have large shadows, large shame bellies, do not consciously hurt other people. Projections come from those in a subconscious way. It's kind of the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing. We think we're Mr. Hyde, but then our projections kind of come out as Dr. Jekyll. So we, like as nurses, we tend to be Mr. Hyde to our patients, and then the Dr. Jekyll tends to come out on our coworkers. And it isn't a conscious malicious thing. It's a byproduct of having a large shadow. And there are some professions that have large shadows. So you're going to see a lot more kind of social shaming. And just because somebody's in management or teaching or doesn't mean it goes away. Sometimes it just gets more subtle and more artful. So it's something to be aware of. All right, so incongruent cultures tend to lead to lower morale, lack of trust, more triangulation, high attrition rates. And just speaking of Jung, talking about the soul-eating emotion of shame, and some of the connections around how nursing kind of gets this reputation of nurses eating their young. And we really do it kind of through subtle shaming. And also to say, I am not immune to it. I am shamed. I'm a perpetrator. If we are nurses, we are probably part of the problem. So sometimes us and looking outward, bully finding, witch hunting, that kind of thing actually hurts us because it's really perpetuating the whole victim perpetrator cycle. And it really starts at looking at what are we doing in the most subtle ways? How are we shaming? Because most of us probably are still doing it, whether we want to admit it or not. Okay. So these are some just quotes about some new grads from this summer talking about some of the picture of the chronic anxiety of the dis-ease, that some of the more incongruent new graduates, and many of our new graduates, they are fairly incongruent and would self-identify as that. We often hear it talked about as imposter syndrome. They feel like they're playing a part, always just waiting to be called out, like they're hiding, looking over their shoulder. And the really sad part about this is that as children who don't have unconditional positive regard, or have, looking at the ACE studies, a lot of adverse childhood events and experiences, they suffer. And then guess what? They go into their adulthood still suffering. And we don't articulate some of the vulnerabilities that would enable them to get free of that. So what we're really looking at is it's an inequity in childhood, which then bleeds into an adulthood inequity. One of the areas from the study this summer that was evident was, actually, I'm just going to go back here real quick while I chat, was age. So as educators, we look at a lot of our nursing students, and nursing students, if you're listening here too, so it's good to know. If you came from a childhood with a lot of trauma, lacking in unconditional positive regard, and you go right into nursing school, and some people still in their house of origin while they're in nursing school, there isn't enough time to really be able to articulate the vulnerabilities, to work to gain relationships of unconditional positive regard, to start working at gaining self-compassion. And then we, in nursing school, and this isn't me, this is in the literature, but I agree, tend to add fuel to that flame of the perfectionistic flame and the incongruence. So if you were already fairly incongruent, we only make that worse in nursing school typically. And again, not to paint a general brush, talking more in an overall cultural habits, and that's kind of training to that ideal. So us as educators, we play a big role in it. And I also, just to mention grit, I don't know if anyone's heard about grit out there, but grit is when we talk about childhood trauma. If you have childhood trauma and you also have unconditional positive regard, some of that childhood trauma can actually build into resilience. However, if you've had childhood trauma and you haven't had unconditional positive regard, it generally doesn't build the grit that we're looking at in the research when we talk about that, when kids come out of more difficult circumstances and they're able to navigate life challenges better. So it is, again, there's kind of interplaying factors that affect us. Okay. So again, I want to jump into workplace factors. This presentation is all over the place because interplaying factors, they're not linear. We all have different factors in our life that we come into nursing with, that we are exposed to in nursing school, and then into the workplace. And while they're all unique paths that we all take, there's definitely some common undertones. All right, so one of those common undertones is redeployment. So while we like to think that we're keeping our new graduates on one stable unit with one stable nursing team so they can get their footing, build relationships, hopefully some of those with unconditional positive regard, what's happening, at least in the study this summer, was evident, is all but 2 of the participants, and there were 8 participants, 3 in-depth interviews with each, all but 2 were redeployed on a fairly regular basis, and it was considered one of their main sources of stress as a new graduate, especially at the beginning of their journey. So this is something really to consider, where policies and programming really can make a difference. And this redeployment, when we're talking about the tree, it's obviously not the roots, but it definitely creates some pretty big windstorms. Another big area, so this is workload. This quote came from one of the most congruent participants in the study, and all the names are pseudonyms, just so that's clear. And so no matter how deep your roots are, we're still vulnerable to the weather. So, and this is where it's not an either or, development and or external, it's a both and. These all interplay. So even if you have really deep roots, you're not going to survive a hurricane, right? And some of these factors are just so intense that all of the participants really, really struggled. Okay. So coworker dynamics. This is a doozy. We spend a lot of time talking about this in all areas, whether you're a nurse, an employer, or an educator. In the area of psychology, it's called social domination. You know, and we talk about even a lot of this with our primary schools and, you know, using the word bullying and whatnot. It's social domination, and we in nursing, we see a lot of it. A lot of it, again, is in the research. And it's also, again, that kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing. Is a lot of it is just subconscious. So what I'm trying to bring to light here is that sometimes hitting the bully button might not be the best approach. And I'll talk a little bit about where it's coming from. Those that are the most hurt in their childhoods, that have their real and their ideal circles the furthest apart, that have the largest shadows, the greatest shame, essentially that personally suffer probably the most, tend to start as the victim, but then they're the most vulnerable to being molded and enculturated into the perpetrators. So I just want to take a pause for a moment here and how we handle social domination in nursing and the policies and the programming that we have around it, and just challenge it a little bit. If we were to breathe compassion into that, would we do it differently? Would there be a better way to approach it in terms of looking at what's wrong with the roots as opposed to the symptoms? What would that look like? Because what we know is that hurt people hurt people. So keeping that in mind, coming from a place of compassion, if we were to look at changes in our culture, that, you know, our culture was born out of decades of, you know, oppression and history. It's not going to change overnight. It took a long time to form us. It's going to take us quite a long time to transform us again, but just keeping that in mind. What would it be like if we were able to give unconditional positive regard, even in the face of scrutiny? How would that change things? Okay, speaking of which, mentorship, huge. It's a really important factor. But I want to point out that not putting a body, assigning a body to a new graduate is not the mentorship I'm talking about. And in fact, that kind of mentorship can go both ways. It can really also hurt new graduate. If there's a lot of conditional regard, then it's actually going to hurt their ability to self-actualize or gain congruence in their role. So in terms of factors that make an effective mentor, we're looking at empathy, congruence. So circles, somebody who has their circles fairly close together. And those are fairly evident in our workplaces and amongst our peers. They're the people that aren't taking things so personally. It's not such a threat to who they are when somebody else is struggling with something or a problem comes up or a mistake is made. It's not seen so much as a personal threat. They tend to be less perfectionistic. They tend to be more graceful towards others who aren't producing perfect type product. And they are able to give unconditional positive regard. So you can't give unconditional positive regard if you are highly incongruent. It just isn't a natural process because you're unable to give it to yourself. You are then unable to know what that's like to even give that to another. So something to consider there with mentors is that they, I don't know why it's not advancing here, but I'm going to keep going. Patrick, feel free to jump in. I'm frozen on this end.
It just looks like we're having some connection issues.
Okay. Is everybody else still here? Oh.
Should be back.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. So the core compassion or core elements of mentorship here. And just to be specific with the congruence, if the mentor is congruent, it helps defeat negative attitudes, conditions of worth that others may have placed on the new graduate nurse. For example, if somebody had said to them that they were slow or incompetent or they feel that way, which most of us did on that journey or do on our new journey, the mentor's warm and genuine approach allows the new graduate to feel valued, which in turn builds self-esteem and trust in their own judgment. Additionally, if they can give that unconditional positive regard, it promotes the ability for them to open up, to talk about their authentic feelings, their areas of moral and ethical dissonance, without fear of being judged or criticized, right? So if you have somebody that is conditional, you're not going to want to share your authentic feelings. It's not going to feel safe. And most of our nursing environments for new graduates, I don't think feel safe. I think they've kind of learned in nursing school, sadly, that they need to put on an image and that their emotions can be a real threat to that image that they're trained to put on. So we create these kind of shells of beings and we put them into the workforce, and they're disconnected from their roots, if we're speaking about trees, and then we wonder why they're so vulnerable to the weather. All right, I'm going on a rant here. Moving on. Okay. All right, so undergraduate factors. There were some key ones that came up with the study this summer. And it was specifically about, looks like I got 10 minutes. Got it, Patrick, thank you. Specifically about self-care was one of them. And I think it is very fair to say that most nursing programs touch on self-care a whole heck of a lot. And self-care is highly important in terms of keeping people connected to their roots. Those who had childhoods with unconditional positive regard, which means they're probably going to have high degrees of self-compassion, will naturally practice self-care. It's what they do. It's just natural. Those who are more on the maladaptive perfectionist end, didn't have those great childhoods, have to actually build habits for self-care because it is not natural. So the big thing from the study is that nursing tends to talk a lot about self-care, but doesn't make time for it. It's not part of the evaluation process, and it's not role modeled. So I could go on about that, but I don't have time. So essentially, it's less assignments and more, or I shouldn't say less assignments, less talk, more bringing it into the curriculum, making it an obvious priority for students to actually do it. So the other one was career advice. We often tell students historically in the research, and I think from my experience still currently, that it's a good idea to consolidate on med-surg. Not all people like med-surg wards. So sometimes what we do is we push these nurses into med-surgical wards because they like to do what they're advised to do. And they think that's the best option, but they're not. Their personality, and this is also in the research, some personalities do not do well in those high stimulus work environments. So they're actually at higher risk for burning out. And yet we tell them to go in there anyway, but we aren't giving them all the information for it to be an informed choice. We also aren't telling them that there are actually windows where people tend to specialize. And one of those big windows is going into your new gradhood from your last student practicum. So if you miss that window, you then have another window, which comes with seniority. So for new graduates to believe that they will go into a med-surg ward, which they may or may not like for a year or two, and then they're going to specialize, is some of them start to feel a little bit bait and switched because it is often not the way it goes, and there's often not a door at that 1 to 2 year mark. So just being really clear with students and maybe oversimplifying that is always the best place to go. And again, I could talk a lot more about this, but we're going to move on here. Okay, and then finally, congruence development. Are we talking to students about their vulnerabilities? Are the ones with really shallow roots aware that they're shallow? Are we even giving them a chance to build their resilience before they go into the field? The only way we can really do this, and this, take a breath as I say this because this is really important. It's not about building assignments. And the research is really clear about explicit curriculum is not the way to change hearts and minds. It's the implicit curriculum. It's the way we as faculty live. Are we being authentic? Because if we aren't being authentic, how can we expect the students that are looking to us to be their example to develop authenticity and congruence? Sometimes we're so afraid of crossing boundaries that we go to the other side and we demonstrate what it looks like to be a shell of a person. And then they kind of go on and model that. So we have to kind of live in that tension of professional boundaries, but demonstrating authenticity. Okay, so bringing it to the overarching areas here, multiple factors interplaying. And we do have common goals as employers, educators, students. We all want to live and work, lead, be led in positive work environments, and to be congruent people with our families and our friends. We want to live our calling, and this is really about synchronizing efforts. It's about getting our circles closer together. It's about working with our own shadows, right? So less about policies. If we're looking at explicit stuff, yes, policies important. Dealing with the weather, we need policies and programming. If we're talking about the roots, we need to start looking in the mirror. Okay, so can we get real? Can we start developing relationships of unconditional positive regard in our workplace? Can we empower our voice, the voices of our youngest members, without feeling threatened because we are more congruent? Can we help them articulate vulnerabilities? Can we articulate our own vulnerabilities so that we can grow our own roots and help others grow theirs? And can we live our calling? So being authentic in nursing is not easy because often the culture works against us because it's about display. Do we have the courage to be authentic, even if that means swimming upstream? Okay, so employer recommendations, workload, redeployment, mentors, okay? Educator recommendations, making self-care less token, informed career guidance, getting into the research and really helping students understand burnout starts in nursing school for new graduates. It doesn't start in the workplace. Many new graduates that burn out started in nursing school. So for us educators to hear that, and incongruence, how we address that burnout starts in nursing school. Okay, I'm just putting this up there because there's some other areas. One, physical violence surprised me and reminded me how an acute stressor, like getting punched for the first time, what that's like. And I think we forget when we've been in the field a long time because it becomes kind of this chronic simmering stressor after a while and very normalized. And just, again, the ability to process moral and ethical dissonance as opposed to kind of pushing it down into our shame bellies or our shadows. I'm not going to have time to go over this, but again, I could probably do an entire week's worth of workshop on this stuff, so I'm trying to stay disciplined here. Okay, for more information, I'm going to put this up. And does anyone have any questions?
Thanks so much, Shannon, for that really interesting presentation. So for those who just joined us later, if you want to ask questions, please type it into the taskbar that's located on your screen, and we will read the question out for Shannon to answer.
And just if anyone's interested too, this is very much living my calling right now. I love this work, and I have been and am more than happy to come and talk to groups, come to meetings. I'm more than happy to try and make myself available for that. So please do feel free to contact me.
Shannon, one question that we have is what are the strategies that you have thought of related to teaching and supporting students for self-care?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and it's this last summer when I was doing the study, it was one of my questions because it came up in the first interview around how can we do it better in terms of making it less just talk, and one of the more detailed suggestions from one of the participants was what if we were evaluated on it? Like it was actually part of the curriculum in terms of, how are you doing on the self-care? So that it's actually kind of monitored throughout the program. It becomes a focused habit of mind, essentially, something that just keeps coming up on the radar. Another one was making time for it. So like one of the participants had said, they tell us constantly to exercise self-care, and yet the workload works against it. Like you do not have time. You have to choose. Am I going to do self-care, or am I going to try and write the paper that I have to write to get through the program? So one of their suggestions was, well, what if they made time for it? Like maybe clinical hours, a half an hour to 45 minutes was set aside for you to do self-care after clinical, and then to make that part of your reflection. So by the time you get into the field, you have those habits of mind. So for those who are incongruent, who don't normally have those habits, they've established them. And you've also developed a habit of reflecting on what works for you, because not everybody wants to do the same thing for self-care, right? We can't prescribe. So I hope that helps.
Great. Another question, what are the recommendations for new grads themselves?
The recommendations for new grads themselves, that's a really good question. I think in terms of the developmental end, it's really about speaking one's truth. So just for my personal, I came into nursing as a straight out of my house, which was not a very good experience. And I didn't start really articulating a lot of what I had packed down in my shadow and shame belly until, I don't know, it's probably in my late 20s. So what I would say to new graduates is, know what's in there. Do you have, what does your shadow even look like? Have you explored that? How is that impacting you? When you have an emotional experience at work, it's generally not about the moment. It's generally taking a Band-Aid off a wound that needs to be addressed, right? It's emotional transference. So it's about self-reflection and having the courage to start that personal work, because the more we deny it, the larger our shadows get, right? And the more our projections actually work against us. And an example of that, even in this study, is looking at two people and how they handle criticism, right? If you're somebody who is so afraid to be told that they're not doing something perfectly, and you go into negative thought rumination, for hours or days, where you're constantly thinking about your mistakes, it's a sign that you might need to start working on, doing some of that self-compassion congruence work so that you aren't haunted like that. It burns emotional energy. Well, it's called surface, anyway, another rant, but self-depreciating thoughts are a really good symptom that you can work on your congruence.
A lot more questions, Shannon. The next one, do you find that these elements would be common to all professions?
No, and this is, so obviously, I come to this as a person, my own opinions in this way. In the literature, nursing is famous for being a highly, we have a lot of social dominance problems in our profession. So, and that kind of comes out in a lot of different terms. We have a lot of bullying issues. We have a lot of toxic workplace complaints and issues. And again, it's that victim perpetrator cycle. And even in the research I did this summer, super interesting to listen to how the kind of habits of mind and the ways of being, and listening to how new graduates get enculturated into the way that we work, and specifically around triangulated communication. So you can't feel safe in a work environment if you're hearing about somebody else's complaint against you from a third party, right? Because what you want in a healthy work environment is to work with each other directly so you can build trust and relationships. And nursing is famous for having all the triangulated communication, which makes people feel really unsafe and makes them feel unable to be vulnerable and authentic. So basically, lack of positive or unconditional positive regard, and lack of ability for people to be authentic because they feel like they're going to be scrutinized and it feels unsafe. I hope that helps. We're famous. That's all. I'll put it as that.
Right, the next question is, do you recommend having new grads take a sense of coherence evaluation, especially if they haven't been exposed to this yet?
Yes, so I actually did a study, a year and a half ago with fourth years around sense of coherence, and just doing the tool is insightful because the score, it's not so much about the score, it's more about the questions and kind of probing you for like, oh, yeah, that doesn't seem very kind to myself, or my perspective is not that optimistic. Yeah, so definitely I think it starts with faculty, nurse leaders, managers, etc., looking at ourselves. I think we need to start looking at our own issues. And I am not coming from a pedestal here. I'm in the muck. I'm as messy as anybody. And 12-step groups, they've got this down. This is nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. There are many models that we could really learn from. Like, for instance, 12-step groups focus on progress, not perfection. 12-step groups, you come around a table and you stick your shame belly on the table, because why hide it? We all have it, right? And we know to release shame, we have to have a safe space to talk about it. And finally, 12-step groups, we talk about looking at diversity in nursing, and can we agree to disagree? Can we be different? Can we enable our fellow nurses to be different from us without threatening us, right? So yes, we can bring this in about congruence, but it's ultimately about all of us kind of taking responsibility or the ability to respond into our work. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Great. The next one is, your topics seem very close and interrelated to resilience. How do these concepts overlap and how are they different?
Yeah, thank you. The nice thing is, I don't think any of this stuff is really new. Like, even Rogers, right? He started his work in the 50s. And in the counseling circles, this stuff is all pretty old hat. So, and grit is another term, resilience, all of which have intertwined. Same with congruence and coherence, right? They're all kind of intertwining qualities. And ultimately, it's about resilience is building deep roots so that you can survive the weather. So, in a way, we're probably splitting hairs. And I think, I know looking at Islands Health Resiliency Training, we all touch on those same buttons. And ultimately, it's about knowing where we're vulnerable, where we can build resiliency, and then being aware of the tools. So I don't know if that answers it. I think they're actually very similar, different terminology.
And the next question asks if you can say a little bit more about Antonovsky's work on meaningfulness and how this might apply to nursing, the work environment, and what constitutes meaning in the caring encounter.
Okay. So the one thing that, living a calling wasn't Antonovsky's work, but it very much plays into it. Antonovsky is primarily around, and even his sense coherence survey is around orientation to life. That's what he calls it. So it's very much about our perception. So if we perceive that we have what it takes to navigate life stressors, whatever they might be, if we feel confident in that way, then we aren't going to experience the cortisol response that somebody else is going to experience when they look at life from kind of a blueprint of lack, if that makes sense. So Antonovsky's work is very much about those that have a confident, optimistic orientation to life, and they ultimately feel that things will work out in a reasonable fashion. And because they trust that and they trust themselves in their ability to navigate their path, they trust their roots. They don't see the weather as so threatening. It's just another stimulus to navigate. So in the workplace, when we have new programs that roll out new policies, etc., the people that have high sense of coherence aren't looking at it like it's a threat to their identity, to their esteem, to their sense of belonging. They're looking at it as a stimulating challenge. So, and that was ultimately what he kind of had decided was the difference between the Holocaust survivors, those that kind of spiraled into a state of dis-ease, and then compared to those who went on to high functioning and states of wellness.
So for educators, how do you keep a high standard of practice but not make that bar so high it is unattainable for the novice? Are there any practical tips, because we want them to strive for improvement at all times?
Yeah. And this is the messiness of it all, right? Like I think we can always fall to either end of the spectrum. And it's really if we are working on our own sense of coherence, we're in those moments better able to respond with compassion. So we help others develop self-compassion by showing them compassion. So ultimately, as educators, if the one thing we can develop is our own self-compassion, we will then naturally give our students compassion. And our students then learn to give themselves self-compassion. And it's just like this infectious cycle. So for example, and this came from the study this summer. One of the students had used an example where she said, as a new grad with the system, we get flagged if a medication is late. So sometimes it's really hard as a new grad or a student to realize that, if you haven't had a break or a drink of water or a moment's rest, like maybe you're an introvert and you just need some time away from the stimulus, but your frame of mind is so black and white that you have to give that multivitamin at 0800 or else, the world feels like it's going to fall apart. And she used the example of sometimes you just need somebody to say, it's a multivitamin. You need a break. Go take your break and let the medication be late. So it's like in those moments teaching people that, sometimes it is kind of gray. And sometimes our self-care is actually more important than the clinical priority that you might feel, haunted by. And it's by showing them how to be self-compassionate, it then frees them up from some of that haunting negative thoughts that they have if they break one little rule, like having a late multivitamin. So that was one example, but it's kind of in those, especially in clinical moments, it's where we can really show our students how to survive in the gray and thrive, really.
Next question asks you, Shannon, is it important to have or find a mentor that is also a nurse?
So let me just put it this way, because this actually came up this summer as well. The most important thing is having relationships of unconditional positive regard. So wherever you get that, that is important. If you work in an environment that's highly perfectionistic, super scrutinizing, where you kind of feel like it's very black and white and you don't feel like you can be authentic, you need to know that you can go home and be yourself. So that's really important to be able to at least thrive in a space in your life. And one of the examples was participants that had more than one life role, that were more than just a novice nurse. Not that that's not enough, but when things weren't going well, when the wheels were falling off the novice nurse bus, they had another bus that they had a lot of confidence and felt acceptance in. They were able to take those feelings of thriving and overlay them into the more stressful work environment. So all that to say, to me, that demonstrates that even if you can't find it at work, a mentor outside that can give you unconditional positive regard can sometimes be enough. It's ideal if you can have both because they really get it. They get a lot of the challenges. I hope that helps.
Sure. And I think that also answers the question that's similar that asks, given the unique nursing culture, do you think mentoring by a non-nurse professional may be a good option? So I think that's a good answer for that question as well. A next question is, are there evidence-based recommendations, such as sleep and exercise, that could be integrated into coursework? For example, going running as a class like paramedics do.
Yeah, so I have a couple things to say about that. I think sometimes in our zeal, we prescribe concrete programs and we overlay them on everybody. And I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that if we really want to encourage authenticity and promote self-integrity, that we have to trust our students to decide what self-care means to them. And some people are so disconnected, so emotionally disconnected from themselves, a lot of people in this world and in nursing and in our nursing students, that they have no idea what they even like because they are so used to doing what other people tell them to like. So sometimes we might be perpetuating that by just prescribing self-care, and it's more about the journey, right? Like, what do you want to do? Try something. Do you like it? No, try something else. And if we did that for 4 years, you know, just imagine, right? The self-growth and the reflection. So I'm kind of, I guess I shy away a little bit from prescribing too much, if that helps.
So there's just a comment and a question. I'm wondering and hoping this helps the students to think about these issues and give them credit for it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, and I think that's it. If we really want to address our work culture and we really think it's important and that will really help our patients, which is also in the research, it does impact quality nursing care, then why not make it part of our curriculum? Like, why not make this a really important standard? Because it is in the research. This isn't this vague topic. And it's about having these discussions of what does that look like. And I don't know all of the answers to that. I'm just asking the questions, I guess. So yeah, I think it would be great.
And I see we're at 1, but we just have a few more questions. So for those who need to leave and log off, we will be recording the rest of the session. So Shannon, are you free to answer the additional questions that are coming? Okay. So the next one is, could we also include role playing in class and how to deal with horizontal violence?
Yeah, and again, I want to be a little cautious about so explicit curriculum and assignments, according to the research, isn't highly effective in this area. What is most effective in this area in terms of cultural ways of being is how we as a culture, we as a team, whatever team you're on, whether that's a nursing unit or in an educator type role, how we deal with each other, then models for the students. So for example, if a work unit or a faculty has a lot of triangulated communication, a lot of implicit shaming and that kind of thing, we're just implicitly showing our students how it's done. That is the most powerful teacher. So it's less actually about the role modeling, because if we're role modeling it in class, but then in real life we're saying, yeah, that's the role we play, but really this is who we are, it's not very effective. So it's, again, more about, it's the looking in the mirror. It's the talking about this, making it a part of our culture, being more transparent, working on authenticity, working on how we handle it when students confront us and challenge us. And is that a threat, or are we promoting that? Like, hey, this is great. That took a lot of courage. Are we feeding them with self-compassion, or are we coming from a place of projection and threat? So yeah, again, it's vague, but I think the only way to make change is actually to focus more on what's happening inside with us leaders.
Next question, is there evidence that a prevailing workplace culture of shame and perfectionism changes those with high self-acceptance?
Can you say the last part again?
Is there evidence that a prevailing workplace culture of shame and perfectionism changes those with high self-acceptance?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. There is actually some really good research articles about this that talk about how pretty congruent people can come into a culture, and that the culture can be so pervasive that people can actually become more incongruent in it. So yes, it is, and it's really what it is about is, if you think about that developmental piece and the creating the shadow self and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need to feel a sense of belonging. And we as nurses identify as a nurse in the workplace and outside of the workplace. It's a huge part of our image. And that has lots of upsides and downsides to it. The downside is if your peers are giving you conditions to be accepted and you identify wholeheartedly as a nurse, you're going to start packing those parts of yourself, those authentic parts of yourself that they don't like, into your shadow, to your shame belly, right? Which is actually going to move your circles further apart. So definitely culture, it impacts us no matter how deep your roots were before you were exposed.
The next attendee was just curious about intersectional factors, specifically issues of race and gender, internationally educated nurses, for example, and how this lack of congruence is felt more acutely by these folks.
Wow, that's a really good question, and I can't speak to the level, like I'm not a topical expert on kind of the whole international front. I would say coming from the place of, if you are in a homogenizing culture, which nursing is known to be, homogenizing mean we like everyone to kind of look, talk, and walk the same. And we have really tight image displays. And I don't mean skin color image displays, but I mean kind of talking about the whole emotional labor thing, that any type of diversity can be at more risk for being threatening. So if you're in a homogenizing type culture, anywhere where you might be a little bit different culturally can threaten that homogenous way of being. So if you've got those intersecting factors, you're just more vulnerable to being kind of slowly shamed out or shamed into assimilating into that culture. I hope that makes sense. I think it just makes people more vulnerable if you've got more diversity.
Great. And did you find that gender had an impact on the outcomes of the study?
All of my participants were females. And, you know, I think gender in nursing is, I mean, a lot of our issues, I believe, and there's a lot of good literature on it, are very much couched in gender type issues. So it's definitely an interplaying factor. For my specific research, I didn't go into that very large field, but I have no doubt that it is one of the interplaying issues.
And the last question asks, how does a sense of gratitude relate to self-compassion? Does one beget the other?
Oh man, these are good questions. I think gratitude, just coming from Antonovsky's work, those that have a positive, optimistic perspective on life, or that life orientation, are going to have higher levels of gratitude, and it also gives people perspective. So, for example, from the study this summer, those that had a more diversified sense of self, so they had another major life role, like they were a parent or they were an athlete of some sort, or they had a hobby that they were really proud of, and they had a lot of gratitude about within that role and a lot of confidence, were able then to kind of bring that over from that place. So I think self-compassion, I don't know how tightly linked those are, but in terms of Antonovsky's work of the optimistic perspective, I think those all kind of interplay.
Great,
so that was vague, and I'm not even sure how to handle that. But
So thanks so much, Shannon, for that great presentation, and thank you everyone for tuning in. It was quite an engaged group. Feel free to come back on the ARNBC website to look for the archived posting of the webinar, and if you have any more ideas that you would like us to explore, please visit arnbc.com or email admin, and we'll be sure to look at that request and keep an eye out for upcoming webinars. So thank you everyone for joining, and thanks again, Sharon.
Yeah, thank you.